guys, welcome to Miss Hall Rates reading number 6. Today we are looking at a book that was the best-selling children's book of all time. It was named that in 2000. It's quite an old book, it's a classic. It was written in 1952, which is quite a long time ago now, but it's still a book that's very popular with both children and adults. This is a book that sort of transcends, that crosses age boundaries. So it's a book that younger children can read, and also older children and also adults like to read this book. So a quick overview of the story. It's quite a pastoral story. That means it's about the countryside and about farms and animals. So if you like books about animals and you like books about farms and families, it's quite a good book about that. The book is, or the main characters of the book are a little girl called Fern, who we can see here on the front, who is 8, and she rescues Wilbur, who is this little piglet here, when her father wants to kill him at the beginning of the book. And Wilbur is the runt of the litter. That's why her father wants to get rid of him. He's the weakest of all the piglets that were born. He's very small and underdeveloped. And Fern saves him from his death, and she brings him up to be quite a healthy piglet, and then he gets sold to somebody else, and he befriends a spider called Charlotte. And the real story is between these three characters here, although there are other animals involved in the story. Okay, I'm going to read chapter 1. This is quite a simple story, but some of the language now is actually quite tricky, so I'd say it's appropriate for year 5 and 6. Although some younger readers could read it as well. So I'm going to read you chapter 1 today. "Where's Papa going with that axe?" said Fern to her mother as they were setting the table for breakfast. "Out to the hog house," replied Mrs. Arable. "Some pigs were born last night." "I don't see why he needs an axe," continued Fern, who was only 8. "Well," said her mother, "one of the pigs is a runt. It's very small and weak, and it will never amount to anything, so your father has decided to do away with it." "Do away with it?" shrieked Fern. "You mean kill it, just because it's smaller than the others?" Mrs. Arable put a pitcher of cream on the table. "Don't yell, Fern," she said. "Your father is right. The pig would probably die anyway." Fern pushed a chair out of the way and ran outdoors. The grass was wet and the earth smelled of springtime. Her sneakers were sopping by the time she caught up with her father. "Please don't kill it," she sobbed. "It's unfair." Mr. Arable stopped walking. "Fern," he said gently, "you will have to learn to control yourself." "Control myself?" yelled Fern. "This is a matter of life and death, and you talk about controlling myself." Tears ran down her cheeks, and she took hold of the axe and tried to pull it out of her father's hand. "Fern," said Mr. Arable, "I know more about raising a litter of pigs than you do. A weakling makes trouble. Now run along." "But it's unfair," cried Fern. "The pig couldn't help being born small, could it? If I'd been very small at birth, would you have killed me?" Mr. Arable smiled. "Certainly not," he said, looking down at his daughter with love. "But this is different. A little girl is one thing. A little runty pig is another." "I see no difference," replied Fern, still hanging on to the axe. "This is the most terrible case of injustice I've ever heard of." Injustice means unfair. Unfairness. A queer and odd look came over John Arable's face. He seemed almost ready to cry himself. "All right," he said. "You go back to the house and I'll bring the runt when I come in. I'll let you raise it on a bottle like a baby. Then you'll see what trouble a pig can be." When Mr. Arable returned to the house half an hour later, he carried a carton under his arm. Fern was upstairs changing her sneakers. The kitchen table was set for breakfast, and the room smelt of coffee, bacon, damp plaster, and wood smoke from the stove. "Put it on her chair," said Mrs. Arable. Mr. Arable set the carton down at Fern's place, and then he walked to the sink and washed his hands, and dried them on the roller towel. Fern came slowly down the stairs. Her eyes were red from crying. As she approached the chair, the carton wobbled, and there was a scratching noise. Fern looked at her father, and then she lifted the lid of the carton. There, inside, looking up at her, was the newborn pig. It was a white one. The morning light shone through its ears, turning them pink. "He's yours," said Mr. Arable, "saved from an untimely death, and may the good Lord forgive me for this foolishness." Fern couldn't take her eyes off the tiny pig. "Oh," she whispered. "Oh, look at him. He's absolutely perfect." She closed the carton carefully. First she kissed her mother, and then she kissed her father, and then she opened the lid again, lifted the pig out, and held it against her cheek. At this moment her brother Avery came into the room. Avery was 10. He was heavily armed, an air rifle in one hand and a wooden dagger in the other. "What's this?" he demanded. "What's Fern got?" "She's got a guest for breakfast," Mrs. Arable said. "Wash your hands and face, Avery." "Let's see it," said Avery, setting his gun down. "You call that miserable thing a pig? That's a fine specimen of a pig. It's no bigger than a white rat." "Wash up and eat your breakfast, Avery," said his mother. "The school bus will be along in half an hour." "Can I have a pig too?" said Avery. "No, I only distribute pigs to early risers," said Mr. Arable. "Fern was up at daylight trying to rid the world of injustice. As a result, she now has a pig. A small one, to be sure, but nonetheless, a pig. It just shows what can happen if a person gets out of bed early. Let's eat." But Fern couldn't eat until her pig had had a drink of milk. Mrs. Arable found a baby's nursing bottle and a rubber nipple. She poured warm milk into the bottle, fitted it over the top, and handed it to Fern. "Give him his breakfast," she said. A minute later, Fern was seated on the floor in the corner of the kitchen, with her infant between her knees, teaching it to suck from the bottle. The pig, although tiny, had a good appetite and caught on quickly. The school bus honked from the road. "Run!" commanded Mrs. Arable, taking the pig from Fern and slipping a doughnut into her hand. Avery grabbed his gun and another doughnut. The children ran out to the road and climbed into the bus. Fern took no notice of the others in the bus. She just sat and stared out of the window, thinking what a blissful world it was, and how lucky she was to have entire charge of a pig. By the time the bus reached school, Fern had named her pet, selecting the most beautiful name she could think of. "Its name is Wilbur," she whispered to herself. She was still thinking about the pig when the teacher said, "Fern, what is the capital of Pennsylvania?" "Wilbur," replied Fern dreamily. The pupils giggled. Fern blushed. So it's a really nice, I think what we regard as a pastoral story. That means it's about the countryside and about animals and a farm life and really small details about conversations animals have and things like that. But anyway, it's a really famous children's book. It's set in America. I didn't do any of the accents today. You might have guessed though from the bacon and maple syrup they eat for breakfast and the donuts and there's a few details that might have made you guess that. Anyway, I would really recommend that to anybody who likes stories about animals, about farms, and about relationships between people and animals.